There were so many free-to-play Korean MMORPGs back in the early 2000s that it was hard to keep up with them all. Today's game was one I wanted to play during its launch in America, but sadly I couldn't, due to my computer just being too weak to handle it. RoseOnline, otherwise known as Rush on 7 Episodes, is a cutesy anime MMORPG similar to Fly for Fun that probably has a lot of nostalgia as well. RoseOnline released all the way back in 2005, being originally published by Korean company Gravity Corporation and developed by Triggersoft. The game originally released as pay-to-play requiring a subscription. For a game that looks like RoseOnline, that would be blasphemy in today's MMO market, but back in 2005, it wasn't uncommon for a lot of MMORPGs to require some sort of subscription service to play it. However, admittedly, it was a bit more rare for Korean MMORPGs to be pay-to-play, since they were all largely free-to-play with a large emphasis on their cash shops. RoseOnline did eventually go free-to-play in 2007 shortly after its release, and shifted its publishing/development companies a few times over the years, with the game even shutting down in 2019, with Gravity discontinuing their service. Luckily, the game officially returned with a small startup game company called Rednum Games, partnering with Gravity to release an officially licensed server and continue development. A slightly similar story to NCSoft's City of Heroes. Now, RoseOnline is still a small niche game, but Rednum Games looks to at least continue Rose's legacy with quality of life improvements, new content, and the removal of pay-to-win elements. After playing the game for a bit and finally sinking my teeth into a game I always wanted to play when I was a kid, is RoseOnline worth playing in 2024? Let's talk about it. Getting started on RoseOnline nowadays is a pretty simple process, albeit having some extra steps involved. Simply navigate to the RoseOnline website, download the launcher, register an account, verify your device with its account security, and then you are good to go. I was actually kind of surprised to see that a game that is so niche as RoseOnline having modern-day security features like device verification and two-factor authentication. Logging into the launcher brings up the character select/creation screen where you can create your first character. Character creation in Rose is pretty standard for this era of MMORPGs, having the choice between male or female, a handful of facial looks and hairstyles, hair color, and then finally your name. Once you complete your character's creation and log in, you are greeted with the game's beginning area. From here you'll get a feel of Rose's aesthetics and style, which has aged sort of like classic World of Warcraft. Character models are cartoony but have pretty expressive animations, and graphically the game is quite colorful with environments and textures obviously being quite dated. However, I do have to admit that it's a bit of a negative that many of the NPC character models and monsters are repeated so often, with some of the same models literally being right next to each other. It screams of early 2000 MMORPG laziness, and it's crazy to see things like that in 2024, but I do acknowledge that RoseOnline is an older game. And to be fair, it's not like RoseOnline was the only MMORPG that was doing this back in the day. Musically, Rose has a pretty upbeat soundtrack with many of its tunes having a pretty joyful tone to them, but I would have to admit that none of the songs really pack the punch that other game soundtracks like MapleStory, Letale, or Fly for Fun do. Getting back to the beginning gameplay of Rose, you play through a relatively loose tutorial quest series that will dip you into the game's features, which introduce questing, combat, exploration, and progression. Navigating in RoseOnline is your standard WASD movement, along with having the ability to left-click where you want your character to walk to. Combat is the standard tab targeting system. Clicking on an enemy or pressing tab will target them for you to attack with your weapon, or use your spells that are assigned assigned to your hotbar. Combat is a bit stiff in that much of what you do locks you into animations you either can't cancel or can't move during, but you do get used to its relatively stiff and slower nature. However, how you engage in combat can depend on what class you choose to play as well as what weapon you choose to use within your class. Like Fly for Fun, you don't choose a class when you create your character. Instead, you start out as a visitor. Anyways, leveling up to level 10 allows you to choose between the 4 class choices, those being Soldier, Muse, Hawker, and Dealer. The Soldier is your standard melee class, Muse is your Mage or Priest, Hawker is your Archer or Thief. Dealer is probably one of the more unique classes in Rose, being a class that specializes in specifically crafting equipment. We'll talk about that more later in the video, but for now, essentially the Dealer, combat-wise, is a gunslinger/summoner class. All classes once chosen at level 10 also have the advanced classes that can be advanced to at level 100. Soldiers can advance to knights or champions. The Muse can become clerics or mages. Hawkers can become raiders or scouts, and dealers can become artisans, or probably the strangest class name, the bourgeoisie. Each level up grants you stat points and 1 skill point. Your stat points can be spent into strength, dexterity, intelligence, concentration, charm, and sense. Each stat influences various things like defense, attack, accuracy, so it's not a bad idea to play around with these points, depending on how you want to build your character. Skill points can be spent into various spells and abilities your class can learn, with each class having passive abilities as well as weapon abilities. Luckily, both stats and skill points can be reset at any point for free, so feel free to play around with different things just to see what you like. But just to kind of set expectations, there really isn't much uniqueness in RoseOnline, honestly. Once again, unfortunately, like Fly for Fun, RoseOnline only has those 8 class choices to choose from. So apart from specific unique build choices or weapons, there isn't a lot of class variety. Questing in Rose is nothing special either, basically having all the same standards like kill X enemy, talk to Y NPCs, or collect Z item. Sometimes you'll be thrown a curveball where you have to explore a specific area to find something that will trigger a cutscene or collect an item, but overall, questing is nothing you haven't seen before from other MMORPGs, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, honestly, and for those who want a story, there is a storyline quest chain that you are encouraged to follow to level up and get equipment. Much like many older MMORPGs though, the story isn't really anything that's going to keep you engaged, but I'll give you a summary. Basically, all the players are visitors, a being created by the goddess who was created to protect the 7 planets, hence the name Rush on 7 episodes. Those planets are technically areas of the game you can explore, but as far as I can find online, not all of the planets in the game lore has actually ever been released. In terms of other features though, let's talk about crafting, PvP, and the community. As I stated before, crafting is largely an exclusive feature that is appointed to the dealer class, hence why many players will create at least one alt that is a dealer class type. Within the dealer class, you have various crafting capabilities that pretty much cover anything you could think of, from weapons, armor, potions, tools, and cart parts, which are basically mounts. Pretty much once you learn a crafting skill, you just need to bring up the crafting menu and craft whatever item you want from your recipe list. Other characters do sort of have access to a crafting system in the refining/enhancement feature. Refinement or enhancement is done at certain NPCs that allow you to effectively power up pieces of equipment. Doing so increases the item's stats, but requires various items, materials, and in-game currency. Like crafting, it's a relatively simple system, and genuinely, I wish each character had access to a normal crafting system, but this is how it works in Rose. In terms of PvP in RoseOnline, there is a community that engages in the PvP arena, but it's basically for endgame players only. The queues for PvP literally start at level 231, and while sure there is dueling and certain areas you can go to and engage in open world PvP freely, you have to go out of your way to get to them as a lower leveled player. For those that do get to that level though, there is PvP dedicated gear and rewards. Endgame in general feels like the ultimate goal of RoseOnline's experience, which would be fine if there was more to do than just quest on your journey to max level. Think of nearly any other MMO out there, and for the most part, besides questing, you'll have instance dungeons, open world bosses, or minigames you can play to break up the grind to max level. RoseOnline basically has none of that, at least not in its early levels. The first queuable dungeon doesn't even unlock until level 120, which seems like a daunting task for new players to join in on the fun. Truthfully, the leveling in Rose isn't too bad if you have help guiding you through quests or camping mobs. It's just getting that help that can be a bit of a struggle. Don't get me wrong, the community in Rose is incredibly friendly, but most players aren't actively wandering around the lower leveled areas, and sadly, many veterans are just multi-boxing with themselves. Basically, you have to really throw yourself into the game's community to find players that will help you level and teach you the game in its early areas, since there is no group-based activities that would naturally push players together, at least in the early parts of the game. Diving further into the game's community, surprisingly, there is a lot more of a player base here than most people would probably assume for such a small niche MMO. It's not going to be huge numbers or anything, but there is a population here. Going to the busier areas, you'll find players chatting, tons of player-owned shops with people trading, shouting for parties, recruiting members for their clans, etc. In general, I think there is more of a player base here than most people would assume for such a small MMORPG. In general, the social features in Rose are great. I love seeing player-owned shops, and the clan system in Rose has the typical features you'd want to see, like clan leveling and perks that power up your members. Finally, the last thing we can touch on is the game's cash shop. I'm happy to say RoseOnline, at least this version, has a very fair cash shop free of pay to win. The shop has the normal cosmetic items for weapons and armor, but there is thankfully nothing, as far as I'm aware, that you can buy that adds any advantage to you as a player. Overall, I think RoseOnline offers quite a lot of content that would entice a potential new player, but the big problem that holds the game back is its initial impression. Nitpicks aside, like how easily you can get stuck on the game's terrain, buggy combat animations, lack of class variety, and lack of swimming, I want to like RoseOnline more than I do. I just can't. I want to experience more of Rose, but unless I level all the way to 100 plus, all I'm ever going to see is zone after zone after zone, where I'm going to be grinding quest after quest after quest. I'm baffled that there is not lower leveled group content that is easily accessible. Why is there not queuable dungeons that start at, say, level 30 and go all the way up to 120? Why is there not lower leveled PvP brackets for players who want to experience lower leveled PvP? It's a shame to see that the same problem that plagues Fly for Fun ironically plagues RoseOnline. Everything that's worth checking out is all at an endgame that most new players will never see. As I understand it, there are problems that have been with this game for a long time now, and the development team is trying their hardest to steer the game into a better direction, so I can't fault them too much. But I can't ignore that these problems do exist in the game. But as with any MMORPG that is constantly updating, maybe a lot of these issues will get addressed sometime in the future. Let's get to my final thoughts. RoseOnline has a really nice looking sharp anime graphical style that has aged relatively well. It reminds me of a chibi version of World of Warcraft, and that's definitely not a bad thing. The game is completely free to play from start to finish. Literally everything in the game can be experienced without spending a dime, and one of the best things that happened when the new company relaunched the game is they removed a lot of the pay to win from the cash shop. There is literally nothing you can purchase that gives you any sort of advantage, except for maybe the mounts, but even that's a stretch. The community is really helpful to new players and will help ease newcomers into the game, especially if you join the Discord and dive into the community resources. Lastly, the game is optimized surprisingly well. Load times are nearly non-existent, at least they were for me, and the game client itself seems to run really smoothly on modern hardware. It's odd to say that other older games don't nearly really have this amount of polish within their client, so I have to give credit where credit is due. Not to mention, like many of these older MMORPGs, pretty much any PC nowadays under the sun will run this no problem. Now, while the client runs smoothly, I wish I could say the same for how the game feels. For one, the game's movement can be really clunky to get used to, and it's really easy to get stuck on the game's environment if you aren't careful. Combat also has a slight delay that takes a bit to get used to. It's not as snappy as other games' combat systems, where movement or inputs in general is immediate. With only 8 classes available to choose from, Rose has a low amount of variety in class choice compared to other MMOs on the current market. Sure, you could argue that each class has multiple different builds you can play within your stats, equipment, and skill choices, but it still doesn't change the fact that fundamentally, RoseOnline only has 8 classes. Content-wise, the game is incredibly repetitive in its early level grind. More or less until you hit mid-game, all you'll be doing is grinding enemies or grinding quests. There is no traditional instance dungeons, no minigames, no world events to take part in that can help break up that monotony, at least in the early game. Nope, unfortunately, all that cool stuff doesn't unlock until you're well into your hundreds in levels, which sucks. I don't understand why there is no content that would help hook in new players, which is basically the last main points I have here. Pretty much like Fly for Fun, all the cool main features of RoseOnline are backloaded into its endgame. I can see the fun in a hardcore level grind, but new players are simply going to leave well before they hit any of the game's more fun content unless they are being power leveled by veterans. It's a major design flaw that I would bet is turning away more players than it's keeping in. Well, that's RoseOnline as it stands today. It's a nostalgic MMORPG that was revived from the dead by a company that largely consisted of fans. However, I fear that with its fundamental core issues, will Rednum Games have the resources to change any of its designs? I guess with the game technically being in early access development, maybe everything I brought up in the video will get addressed. Anyways, are you playing RoseOnline? Did you play it back in the day? Comment below and let me know. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to support my content. Follow all my social media in the links in the description below, and I hope to see you all next time.